a big benefit of Web 2.0 apps, where you don't have that backwards compatibility. Everybody's on one version. So as they develop Vista and try and maintain 16-bit DOS support, so you can still run Doom before the Windows port, it's a battle. It's particularly a big battle for them because they have to pay the developers to do it and fight through it, and it's a big problem. I'm glad I don't have to solve it.
Is that an advantage to the open source world? Is the fact that you can always recompile with newer libraries? Because generally, source is where it doesn't break as often as binary compatibilities when you're dealing with closed source apps. Yeah,
but from Microsoft's vantage point, they have the source code for the most important part of that relationship. From an open source standpoint, when you're faced with that problem, you always have the option of saying, I don't want to do that backwards compatibility, and dropping it. If enough people want it, they can pick it up as a fork or complain and persuade you otherwise. But I think you have a lot more freedom in an open source project faced with that situation than a proprietary billion-dollar company where you have such a large installed base that when you drop support for something, you hear about it from a larger client base.
Well, my opinion on it is basically with a closed source, really their employees can work on it. Whereas with open source, it's open to the community. So if somebody doesn't like something, you just pull it out. Otherwise, you have to wait on Microsoft. Of course, they're going to take forever, ever. Whereas, you just say, hey, can you write this portion? Yeah, great. Can you write this portion?
Mm-hmm.
That's the advantage of it.
But one of the trade-offs is that, too, is it turns until we get this into a meritocracy, where I think it covers on Lug Radio a few episodes back, where if it's something that's interesting, then it gets a lot of people working on it. But if it's less interesting, but it's still critical, then you get one or two people on, you hope they stay on it, so it keeps being worked on.
The code is always going to move, it's always going to evolve, it's always going to change. I mean, you're never going to have the same person working on the same piece of code at one point in time. You're going to have a lot of people that are going to stick around, but that's the whole point. A different person can code a different viewpoint.
If you look at SourceForge, there are thousands of apps that were started, but they didn't actually get anywhere because they didn't achieve critical mass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of software development projects, open source in particular, but all of them, are started to scratch an individual niche. Oftentimes an individual will get bored or find a different solution, or decide, hey, I really don't want to rewrite all this tons of code just for my little itch. So if searching SourceForge, you can find tons of projects that are in that boat. But also, there's the projects where an individual has a niche that they want to fill. They write the code, it sits for a year, and then it becomes a big thing. Samba is a great example of that. If you read the history of that, Jeremy Allison did it in like 1992, and it just sat dormant for years. That he had a need for it in his company, and then several years later, lots of other people said, hey, Linux is cool now, I want to hook up my Windows share to it. And the project took off from there. So there's a big balance between how many people the software project will fill and the time that it'll take to do it.
Do you think that, like, between Samba and Wine and OpenDoc, they're going to have a reasonable chance of undermining Microsoft's domination in certain areas?
I don't. I don't think that's the right way to do it. Samba and Wine are tremendous projects, and they do great things, but they try and do the things that Microsoft is doing better than Microsoft is doing them. And that's just an impossible battle to win. a few years ago, Samba's performance just blew Windows out of the water. And Windows Server 2003 came around, and normal file sharing performance isn't that different between the two. Windows Server 2003 is actually stable now. When they did their new Active Directory stuff, it broke everything in Samba for managing domains. So Microsoft it can always be one step ahead of those types of projects. Anything innovative that Samba or an open source project does can easily find its way into the proprietary code, even if it's not a direct code copy. But the opposite isn't always true. There's things that Microsoft can do that are just tough to reverse engineer. It took Samba quite a long time to really get their Active Directory stuff together after Microsoft blindsided them and released that.
What about like the software patent current EU battles?
Oh, man. I want to rant about that, but I'll refrain myself. Software patents are wrong. Every country that's doing that just needs to be instructed the proper way of developing software, because obviously the people that are managing that don't know. The problem with software patents are that you patent the process of doing something, but in software there's tons of different ways of doing that. So you really have no benefits of the patent, but you restrict competition. And that's something that we're done here in the US and the EU. And it's a terrible blow to open source. And unfortunately, commercial software is the one that has lots of money to throw at politicians and lobbyists and marketing, and I'm not sure how open source really combats that other than disseminating that knowledge, which is something that open source is good at.
Well, we got a few friendly vendors like IBM who has the most patents. And Red Hat. A few others have made the association where they share patents.
Yeah, now that open source has caught on to that and realized the value of software patents, especially the corporate contributors like IBM and Red Hat, the open source has started to realize that value and amass what they can with that, which is a good thing. But it's still something that needs to be abolished.
Well, we kind of go back to what he was saying, and I apologize for coming in late if you already covered it.
No problem.
Really, in my opinion, the battle is going to be won against Microsoft as far as getting it on the business desktop. If we can get more adoption by businesses, because people, I got this Microsoft at work, I can have it at home. That's the way they think. And so if you get more people familiar with it, and we can, the open source community can develop more business apps and have more of a business angle to it, I think you could really make a case for open source. But as long as it stays in an obscure edge of the community, Microsoft dominates the market. And I mean, if you just leave it in the community, if you leave it in the consumer category, it might not get anywhere. But if you put it on the business community, where you got one company with 20,000 desktops, and you got multiple companies like that, the more and more, the more you get it out there, the better off it will be.
Yeah, that's exactly how the battle between IBM, Microsoft, and Apple was. Microsoft reached the business community first, and they went on to win. But that was a bit different because, back then nobody bought a home computer without using the same thing at work first. There was a horrible phobia about computers, and you had to be familiar.
Well,
and
it still carries over even today. That's what I'm saying.
Yep, there is, and I certainly won't disagree with you because you're making my point.
I came in late, sorry.
But it is less than it was in the mid 80s. I think it still has a lot to do with market share, where, certainly in the mid 80s, once you reach businesses and you got businesses to take over, you won market share just because that was it. Now I think that's possible to win over that market share by reaching consumers first. I think that if you put out a good killer app and reach consumers first, that will spread over to
There's
businesses.
so much competition in the consumer market. That's why, I mean, you've got Apple, you've got Linux, you've got Microsoft, you've got how many other different distros of Linux. So you've got so much competition on the consumer market. That's why I'm saying I think it would be more of a,
Yeah.
the way that you would form a battle plan is to really form more business-friendly free apps. Because the business is going to look at it and say, hey, wait a minute, I can get this piece of software that I can use that I don't got to pay Microsoft or IBM buku bucks for. And I've already got a community of people that pretty much understand that. We just have to retrain them.
Mm-hmm.
Once
Yeah.
that happens, you have widespread adoption, then people start, oh, hey, I've got Linux at work, I can run Linux at home, or
Mhm.
whatever the case may be.
Yeah, it's certainly a good point that because the business market is more limited and doesn't have as much options, and there's a clear delimitation between, okay, we can set up this option with Linux or with a web technology and it will cost this much money, versus if we do it with Microsoft or another technology, it will cost this much money. In business, there's a very clear line where once you cross that, it makes business sense to adopt open source or Linux or whatever it is that you're adopting. And consumers, there isn't that clear of a delineation. Consumers can be, you'll reach this set of consumers if you do this and include this feature, but you won't or you'll reach a different set if you don't include this feature, include something else instead. So, yeah, it's a good point that I'd say the business market is still easier to penetrate, but I don't think that the consumer market and that path into all of computing, I don't think that that's closed off.
Well, I've talked to a lot of different CEOs. Most CEOs are very business-minded. They're clueless when it comes to their technology. So I think if we can educate more CEOs and decision makers as to the advantages of it, that more people could, because they're the guys that are saying, they're the ones that are getting wine and dine like Microsoft and said, $multi-billion package.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Linux or open source or web apps just don't traditionally have the guy that takes the CEO out to dinner. Corporate sponsorship through,
There's got to be other ways that you can do it, that you can turn people on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the corporate sponsorship through IBM and Red Hat, it's just helped the community tremendously. But it is just a matter of getting the information out there. It's not that the CEO has to be taken to dinner to endorse a product, but the CEO has to be familiar with it. Case in point, I was aware of a company that was evaluating network vendors, and pretty early on, the technology guys had discounted Cisco for the networking hardware. Cisco had came in late on the quote, and they really didn't like working with the interface and just didn't want to deal with Cisco, so they axed them. And then corporate management came in and pretty much said the equivalent of, I don't know what companies you're considering, but we see Cisco commercials on TV. What's wrong with them? And
People believe what they see.
how open source fights that and gets the information to the masses is a tough challenge, and one that it's not all that well suited to fight. Yes.
I read that, like Google, for instance, is planning on releasing like complete Office suite through, I guess, web service 2.0 or Web 2.0, and they believe that will be one of the things that will secure their own protection from Microsoft and like competition for search dominance in the future. Do you foresee that that could be something that could very much weaken